welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to be able to welcome Linda, which I'll do in just a moment or two. What I want to do right now is welcome you all and do my regular introduction. Many of you have been here since the beginning, April 2020, so 2 years and counting, that I've been doing these free monthly webinars. And others of you, you're here for the first time, welcome. I love that you interact with one another, and I do want you to know that after the webinar, I do read all of the comments in chat. We are a community, and you're just more than welcome, you're valued. And I look forward to reading your comments. You are, in fact, my tribe. Readers and writers. I've given you a brief update on New York each time. I started in April 2020 by calling New York dystopian, and I am delighted to report that New York has always been a place for new beginnings, and so it seems now. I'm seeing a lot of people flood back. People are coming back to the office, and it does remind me of the great Stephen Sondheim song, Another 100 People, from one of my favorite plays, Company. You know that song? Another 100 people just got off of the train, came up through the ground, while another 100 people just got off of the bus and are looking around at another 100 people who just got off of the plane. That's what it feels like. People just coming, and it's great. It gives me hope. Speaking of hope, I hope you're all vaccinated and boosted and doing well. Each month, I also show you a photo of a garden or something in a garden. Normally, it's the Tudor City Greens, which are very close to where I live and work by the United Nations in Midtown Manhattan. Today, we're going to go a couple of blocks in another direction to Katharine Hepburn's garden. This is a skinny little slip of a garden in Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, right by the UN. You know Katharine Hepburn, right? Great actress from Hollywood's golden age. She lived in my neighborhood. And let's take a look. So here's the plaza. That's the UN at the end of the walkway. The Katharine Hepburn is this little skinny area over there. And that maple leaf indicates it's a city park. And here it is. Isn't that beautiful? It's just this little flagstones that go up through this tiny little area. And the stones are each, not all, but many are engraved. And they're with her sayings. Without discipline, there's no life at all. Those of you that know me, I talk about the 4 Ds, right? Determination, dedication, deadline-driven, and discipline. Sometimes I wonder if men and women really suit each other. Perhaps they should live next door and just visit now and then. Given that she said it in the 1950s, that's pretty avant-garde, right? If you always do what you want, at least one person is pleased. What interests you? I like that. And here we go. Yes, more free webinars were scheduled with topics through September. John and I have figured the dates for October and November, but here we go for July 16. We're getting down to the sentence level. 3 surefire techniques for writing next level prose. We're going to take a wider lens view in August on the 13th for writing the truth, where I'll be talking about writing about people with disabilities, racism, and sexism. And then in September, how to revise your own work, right? You read it, you look at it, looks good to you. Now what? And I think in October, John and I were just talking, I think I'm going to do how to plant clues. Certainly for mysteries, but all fiction, and I would even suggest for something like a memoir, you really need to know how to make the revelations you ultimately come to not seem coincidental or contrived. And then we have 2 new Mystery Mastermind virtual workshops coming up. Starting in September, these are limited to 5 people only, 6 sessions spaced 2 weeks apart, although we're skipping one because Thanksgiving gets in the way. So the last between 5 and 6, it'll be 3 weeks. On Sundays, it's going to be for cozy writers, how to write your cozy mystery together. And on Fridays, it's going to be how to write your mystery and thriller together. So I'm opening it up to anyone who's working in crime fiction. And these are 1 to 4 in the afternoon. We're sort of getting there. We're getting all the dates set and John's getting the registration set up and so on. But if you want to know that you're going to get first dibs, go ahead and get on the insider list, and that's the link there, because that way you get a little advance notice to claim one of the spots. All righty, so that's it for this. Now I can segue into introducing my special guest, because we were named the Black Orchid Novella Award, which is co-sponsored by the Wolf Pack, the literary society that celebrates all things Rex Stout's legendary detective, Nero Wolfe, and Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazine. We sponsor together the Black Orchid Novella Award. We're in our 16th cycle now. We're about to begin our 17th cycle. And we were named one of the best contests by Readsy. So we're pretty excited about that. And I think you can see why. You get publication in one of the top mystery magazines in the world, $1,000. If you can get yourself to New York City, we fetch you in style. And there's no entry fee. So all the rules are on nerowolf.org. You see it there, and I know John is putting it in chat. The deadline just passed, May 31st. I just sent out all the submissions to the readers. But you notice that I kind of tweak the date here. This is me doing that because we've begun our 17th cycle. Yay us. And so get going on that novella, 15,000 to 20,000 words. You can't use the characters. There's got to be a crime. We're looking for literary excellence. Write us a novella. All right, so I'm going to stop the share. And now I'm going to introduce Linda. Welcome, Linda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a joy and an honor. Linda is the editor-in-chief of Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, which is in fact one of the premier magazines for short stories, specializing in mystery in the world. And she is more than that. She is also runs podcasts. I'm going to let her talk a little bit about that. I have a question about that, but they're really interesting and good, solid. She has edited the commemorative anthology, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine Presents 50 Years of Crime and Suspense, and the anthology, the magazine, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, presents 13 tales of New American Gothic. I want to know what that means, don't you? We're going to have her define New American Gothic. And she was a board member of the New York City chapter of the Women's National Book Association. I've known Linda for a number of years. She is so talented as a writer in her own right, I'll just say, but also as an editor. She has an astute understanding of what readers want. And that's one of the reasons why I am just so pleased she's here. And she's so generous with her knowledge. So we're going to focus on 2 things: how to write a short story that sells and how to sell a short story that sells. These are, of course, interrelated. And you know me, if you've been here at all, I write for my readers. I want my work to sell. So I try to understand what readers want. And I think that's a pretty good place to start. Linda, hello, welcome. What makes for a good short story?
Well, it's not really one thing. I think maybe every editor has something different that they read for, but I really think the language and the texture strike me first. And then I think a short story is so tightly focused, it's almost like poetry, more like poetry than a novel. I think it's Um,
Tell me what you mean by texture.
oh, I guess I read very slowly, and I think I read at the speed of sound. So, um, how it reads to me, how the language sounds is just very important to me.
Do you think when you hear all the time about an agent or an editor, they are looking for a voice? Is this what they're talking about?
So I find that kind of hard to define sometimes because it's not always the character's voice, it's a narrative voice. And,
Hmm.
sometimes those are very closely related and sometimes they're not. But it's
That's
kind of,
interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. Um, Before we get away from that American Gothic thing, go ahead and define it for us.
well, I think when I did that anthology, I was looking for stories that were modern, not necessarily the old fashioned kind of Gothic. And so we have stories about um, pollution, about, kind of um, just more, just a much more modern sensibility, a kind of edge of horror to it. But
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
This, I've had, for those of you that don't know, I write the Josie Prescott Antiques Mystery Series, and it includes 14 novels published by St. Martin's, 3 short stories, and a novella published by Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine. And I've had other short stories published by Alfred Hitchcock as well, including a new one called The Witch coming up, a short one.
Mhm.
Do you know yet, by the way, when that one's going to be published?
I don't think we have that one scheduled yet.
So, when that's also important to know that when a short story is bought, that doesn't mean it's going to appear in the next issue. It
Yes.
may be a year or longer.
We
Uh,
work so far in advance. If someone said, something's coming out in 2023, I think, wow, that's quick.
that's great.
Jeez.
That's funny. Um, what's the difference between a short story and a novel?
um, well, I guess the thing going back to thing more like poetry than a novel is, and I really think it's that focus, that having a theme that's very um, central. It doesn't have to be one action, it could be one kind of sensibility, but everything kind of relates to that. It's so economical, just everything forwards that one idea. There's no room for just anything extraneous.
So there has to be a through line plot that is quite direct.
There has to be something. I read stories I've liked a lot that didn't feel like it, kind of went from point A to point B. But when you go back and reread them, you realize that everything is unified in a sense. And I think in mysteries, we're very plot driven, in a sense. So I tend to think in terms of plot, but um, there's room for kind of opening. I guess part of me, I never want to say anything definitively, because then the story comes along and it just knocks your socks off and breaks all the rules. But
Got it. The shortest short story you've ever bought of mine was, I think, 639 words. It was a little shorty. And the longest was, it was a novella. So I'm trying to think, it ran about 90 pages. So that probably, I think it was 23,000 words, something like that.
Mhm.
That's quite a range,
Right.
from 630 to 23,000. What's the ideal? What length do you desire?
I think most stories fall in around 3,000 to 8,000, say, in that category, and that's um, say 10,000 words might be what, about 20 pages in the
Yeah.
magazine. So that's
Mhm.
kind of a long story for us.
Mhm.
I know our novellas, we give a range, kind of a rough range, up to about, you know, 20,000 or so. But so, that's most stories are around 15 to 20 pages. I think we tend to publish perhaps slightly longer stories than other magazines. So, um, but I think that's a comfortable range for us.
That's great. Um, let's talk about the writing itself. And um, everybody always talks about showing versus telling. Um, you tell to summarize, and you
Mhm.
show to get the reader in the moment.
Uh-huh.
Do the rules still apply that it should all be showing, which is what you generally hear? Or because we
Yes.
have so little space, does telling make sense?
I think, sometimes that's one of the mistakes I think I see writers do is they take that show don't tell maybe too literally. I think you're looking for really vivid imagery, anything vivid that really kind of captures your story. Um, and same with dialogue. You're looking for, the one or two phrases that really kind of capture a whole conversation. But to have the whole like a phone conversation, hello, how are you? How are you doing? It bogs the story down. So you really, there's a room for summary to get from point A to point B, but the writer has to decide what the important scenes are, what's going to move the story forward, and to make that as vivid as possible.
In the instructions for the Black Orchid Novella Award, you specifically refer to a telling detail.
Mhm.
Can you help us understand what that is?
I think, sometimes I think with short stories, everything has to do kind of every image really has to work. So I think you can't really have the room to say describe the whole person or the whole background, but you can have one or two things that really kind of set the reader's imagination on fire, so the reader gets a really full picture from maybe just one thing. If
Mhm.
it's slamming the phone down on the desk, and there's old phones all over the place that say this happens every day or something. You get a picture of a character. So I think that's the thing that I think that makes reading short stories so exciting, is that there's one thing, there's just so few elements in it, and yet your imagination works to fill in the pieces. And I think that's why people like flash fiction so much, is that you really have to work to get that story in there, but then the readers like fill in the rest, and that's what
Yes.
makes reading fun.
And flash fiction is typically defined as 750 words or fewer. How do you pick the Bona winner, Black Orchid Novella Award winner?
Well, I go over every story. We have our pre-readers who help me with you kind of sorting out the plots, and because I tend to I'll admit I tend to read less for plot than for character. And but we're looking for a classic detective. We're looking for a detective that solves a crime with his mind, with not and a lot of the mystery needs to play fair with the reader. There's a whole buildup of clues that leads to kind of a satisfying um, resolution. And then I look for character. I mean, I think, although we're not looking for pastiches of Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, we're looking for interesting characters. I mean, that's the fun of a old-fashioned detective, is that they bring their own quirkiness to it. And the fun for us of introducing new detectives to our readers, they're all different. So,
And you really have a variety. I mean, um, a lot of offbeat stuff. I don't want to say offbeat like wacky,
mhm,
but you have. I just Mark Thieman's. This was in the March issue, um,
uh-huh.
and it was called. What is it called? Mark Thieman's about Julie, the con woman.
Oh, in the hardware store.
in the hardware store. John, you know
I
this.
believe that was a DIY, wasn't it?
What was it called?
DIY.
DIY?
Yes, yes, it was. That's the name of the story, DIY.
That's it. DIY. Yes, thank you. I loved that. I mean, we have a detective who's a store security guy, quote unquote, and a con woman. So I just thought that was a charming story, very witty. And my point is that you don't have to be thinking traditional detectives.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's some cliches of detectives, I think, just to be wary of because they're overdone. So
Like what?
um, I think, I see a lot of the detectives are broke and they're sitting in, their dingy little office. And sometimes it works. It gives the detective an extra challenge, but we see a lot. We see a lot of that. So
And probably the police detective who's a drunk.
not so much that, but they have a terrible tragedy in their past, that kind of spurs them on. So
Do you see a lot of reporters and a lot of lawyers?
I think I see more lawyers and reporters, which maybe speaks to the state of our newspaper industry.
Yeah, all the newspapers are closing down. There are no more journalists. Yeah, that's interesting because there used to be a lot, I know. And that goes to show that there are trends in this as in anything else.
Yeah. Which,
And
to say back to the bonus stories, a reporter would make a fine character. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone who's an official detective. He just has to do that detecting work.
right.
So one of the stories that we've done is there's investigator for an attorney. I'm blanking on the title. It's a few years ago by Mark Bruce. Minerva is the attorney and her investigator. So
Yes.
it can be any kind of profession. I mean, that's what makes it more interesting. And
Didn't we have artificial intelligence win one year?
that was we had the professor who looked into the cars that were driven by artificial intelligence.
That was it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's just broaden it to all short stories. Tell us some common errors that you see. We just heard one, a sort of derivative and trite lead character.
Uh-huh.
What else?
What I see a lot of, and this may be particular to mystery stories, but really straining to sound like Raymond Chandler. I mean, talk about, narrative voice. I think you just kind of need to sound natural to yourself. I think not starting the story. I don't know how to say this, but I think sometimes I see a lot of backstory entering the story. It's like the writer is afraid to cut that out. It's like it's a good way maybe to get yourself into a story. But I think when you start to polish it, look for where the story really starts and cut out the backstory, because a lot of that you can leave up to the reader. The reader can fill in the details or not. I almost think too many details can flatten a story because it cuts off the imagination that the reader can bring to it. So I would say, it's something I have to look critical at, because, I do sometimes backstory is the story. I mean, again, it's like, I hate to say never,
Right.
but, I sometimes see backstory within backstory, and that's kind of a clue to me that, that's, but I think sometimes writers need to, you need to have fully imagine your character. So maybe it's good in your drafts to write out your backstory. So by the time that you focus everything and narrow things down and cut out what's not necessary, because you've done the work of it fully imagining that character, it's he or she is much more vivid on the page, I think.
I think that's a truism for writing everything.
Uh-huh.
Would you agree that you have to know everything, but just because you know everything, you don't have to share everything?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it comes through, that you've done that imaginative work and the reader can see it. The reader might not know it, but you can feel it.
Gets back to those telling details.
Yeah.
Interesting. What topics are off limits in Alfred Hitchcock?
Um, well, I mean, it's ironic that we're a magazine where murder mysteries are entertainment, but we shy away from a lot of overt violence. Sexual violence kind of turns us off. Um, Violence involving children is a big no-no, and for my boss who leaves everything about the magazine to us, he doesn't step in and tells us what to do or what not to do, except they're very upset about that. They've said that too. We all kind of feel that way, I can say, at our sister publications too.
About no violence about children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we there's not a rule about it, but people do get upset when animals are involved and tortured. In fact, I had an upcoming story. It starts with the dog locked in the car, and our proofreader emailed me and said, "Can I finish this?" So, so we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, makes sense. And by the way, this is a universally applied principle. The only story I've had rejected from Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine involved a child who was already dead. Like, you did not see the child die, but it still was just an unacceptable premise of a story. And for those of you who know me, you're going to find it hard to believe that I would write such a thing. I must have been in a very angry mood in particular. Yeah. Do you ever ask authors to revise their work? And if so, have any ever refused?
I can't remember. I want to say that someone did refuse once, but I really can't. I don't think so. And the thing is, I really do rarely. I really have to see for myself where I think the story can where the revision will come from and what would improve the story. So maybe once every 2 or 3 years that'll happen. I think I've done it 3 or 4 times.
Asking for revisions.
Yeah, and
that surprises me.
An early story that I liked a lot. It's just that at the very end, it had this very long, very detailed torture scene, which I felt like the writer could do a little bit more summary there, and we would get the point. And I think it was a better story. I think I had another story. We went through a couple of passes where the solution was coming through in a dream, and it just was not really believable. It's like, I don't know. My dreams are pretty incoherent, but but as we worked on it, and he came up with what I think is just a brilliant solution, where it's still coming through the character's subconscious, but it's more like how we live. So it was much more believable.
It felt more realistic.
Yeah.
And you once asked me in one of my Josie stories, let me just provide context. I consider myself very strong in plotting. And there's 2 ways that people write. You plot, and then you figure out what people would do those things. Or you come up with the characters, and then you figure out what those people would do. I'm the former. I plot first. And as a result, my character motivations, it is something I have to consciously work on. And you suggested in this short story that I add something, Josie being kind, a little regretful that her friend was a killer or had died or something. I don't even remember which now. And I thought, well, that makes sense. It's like, there I go again, where I just don't always think of the emotions and the motivation because I'm so focused on the plot. So from this author's point of view, thank you. Definitely you made it better, but you also caught something that I really struggle to catch. And for those of you that come to the webinar on how to revise your own work, you'll see me talk more about this. In order to know what we need help with, we have to know what we're not good at or not as good at or where we want to improve. And this is, for me, an example.
It reminds me of something sometimes I notice in stories where characters are just a little too easy about murder. They just murder somebody and then, kind of go on with life as if nothing had happened. And I think there's no kind of reflection or, kind of just shock to the soul that you've just done something. And, sometimes with some sorts of stories, that's not part of the story. But I think it's something to keep in mind that, it does something to you. I'm assuming, I can't say from experience.
Yeah, those of us that write murder mysteries, and they, the old principle about write what you know, not necessarily. No, but I think that's exactly the point about the character motivation. When you're plot driven, you're just, excuse me, murdering someone and then solving the murder, as opposed to stepping back and saying, how would this person actually feel about that? Or what would be their corollary reactions? And yeah, so I think that's a very good point. If someone wants to submit a short story to Alfred Hitchcock, what's the process?
Well, have patience for one thing, because we do run way behind, and we're always struggling to catch up. But we have an electronic submission service server now that works out pretty well for us, and I think it's fairly easy. Just drop your story in, as a regular Microsoft Word document. We don't ask that the stories be that you only submit to us. It'd be exclusive submission because we do know it takes us a long time. We do ask if you've sold the story in the meantime to another publication, you let us know so we can take it out of our queue.
So in other words, you only accept previously unpublished stories for submission.
Right.
And when you say
our stories are original, and we say that in our contract. So
good. And when you say to be patient, how patient?
Well, this is embarrassing, but we are running almost a year behind. Just when we went to electronic submissions, everything tripled. So we're still playing catch up.
Wow, that's interesting. And here's a little asterisk comment. We only accept Black Orchid Novella Award submissions in hard copy. So the electronic submission system has nothing to do with the Bona Award.
Right.
And we only work with hard copies.
And partly, to keep it separate from our electronic submissions, because otherwise something might get lost.
Well, there's that, but also we have a whole cadre of separate readers who are Wolfpack people, not Alfred Hitchcock people, right?
Yeah.
And I also think that when you say they triple, this is pretty good evidence, it seems to me, that if people want to submit, they'll print it out and put it in the mail. Like it's that extra level of commitment, perhaps.
Yeah.
That may be unfair of me, but that's my perception.
Yeah. Reading stories electronically, and on the one hand, it's a boon. It's lighter on your shoulders. I can travel around with 10 stories at once on my iPad. But I miss the old days of having the paper and scribbling in the margins, and so getting the Bona manuscripts is a little vacation almost. You go to a coffee shop and just read through
And
the.
I know some of our listeners today are international. They are from around the world. And I want you to know that this year, more than ever before, I want to say probably 10% of our submissions are international. So
Wow.
you too are welcome to submit. We have our first submission from Germany this year.
Wow.
Okay. Alfred Hitchcock is under the Dell magazine umbrella, as is Ellery Queen magazine. How is EQ different from Alfred Hitchcock?
Well, I think, each editor has their own sensibility of what they like and dislike. I think what I see, I think Ellery Queen is really strong with very traditional mysteries. They do a lot more pastiches. I'm not a particular fan of pastiches. Ellery Queen does this great in their January, February issue devoted to Sherlock Holmes pastiches. They do more things like locked room mysteries, more kind of subgenre things like that. And I think I sort of see Alfred Hitchcock as being perhaps a little bit more open to things that are just a little offbeat. Maybe a little bit more open to supernatural elements, although I don't, we can't do too many, but that's just kind of how I see it. But
What other
and
Dell magazines? Are there other Dell short story magazines?
we have the two science fiction magazines, Analog and Asimov's.
And they also accept submissions?
Right. And we're all on, do the same electronic submissions and looking for original stories. And
good. So that was Analog and Asimov, Ellery Queen, Alfred Hitchcock, and that's it, right? Those are the four.
Right.
How can authors find places to submit to? Perhaps literary fiction or fantasy? Are you aware of others?
I'm not that aware, I have to say, of other venues. I know there's like Black Cat Mystery Magazine, there's The Strand Mystery Magazine, there's Mystery, is it called Mystery Magazine?
Mystery Scene, but that's nonfiction.
Right. So there are and there's also the anthologies that come out of the various conventions that are, I from my understanding, they're read blind. So, and they're themed. So,
good.
Granted, the venue for short stories is shrinking now. It used to be there was always a short story in every magazine.
Right. And that was one of the ways that Mr. Stout, Rex Stout, certainly got exposure for his books. Duotrope is an aggregator of submission options. And I will tell you, they keep up to date and they take it very seriously because I get contacted once a year to make sure that the Bona Award is still current and everything is exactly right. So that would certainly be one. Various anthologies, I think lots of organizations, especially writers' organizations, offer anthology options. That's worth checking out. And then, of course, Writers' Market and the Literary Marketplace. Those also would be good sources. Linda, is there anything you want to add before we open it up for the Q&A?
I would just, and I always say this, I feel like a broken record, but I feel like before you send your manuscript in, just read it out loud or have it read to you so you can just hear how it sounds. I just think that's the best advice I could give. I wish, more people kind of just listen to their writing. And I also, we get a lot of submissions, and a lot of those submissions are really good stories. And sadly, we can only publish about, say, 10 per issue. And, we come out 6 times a year. So I think just if don't get discouraged, keep writing, keep trying, and just understand um a hard market right now, but there are ways to break in. So just keep trying.
Those are both very good tips. And I'm going to come back to both of them, but you just said something that I want to pick up on. Speaking of reading aloud, you do podcasts. Talk to us a little bit about your podcasts.
Well, I mean, what we do is we have our authors, if they want, read their stories. Or sometimes they're read. Our managing editor, Jackie Sherbo, is a great reader, and she's done some of the stories too. One of our authors had a great story. She couldn't just bring herself to read it. We went on and on about a year, going back and forth. Finally, Jackie read it and did a great job. But so we give our authors the opportunity of reading their stories. And sometimes you ask them a little question. Afterwards, they can talk about the story. But, it's just, I think it's fun just to hear the author's voice.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And sometimes that's totally different than the way I read the story.
That's interesting too.
Yeah.
So you mentioned reading it aloud, and that is actually one of my best revision tips. If you find yourself stumbling over a sentence, don't try to reread it. Fix the sentence, right? Yeah. If you find that the language, you're getting a little embarrassed because the dialogue sounds stilted, believe your embarrassment and work to make it sound more natural. Those are just two little examples, but the benefits of reading it aloud, I agree 100%. I've been known, I print out chunks of whatever I'm working on and just pace around the house, reading it aloud with a pen in my hand. And I catch things all the time, including typos, by the way, things that my eye didn't catch when I was reading it on the screen.
Yeah.
I think it's also important not to get discouraged. I think that's right. But I do think that what you said, that one of the common errors was a lot of authors try to sound like Raymond Chandler. I think it's really hard to sound fresh, to come up with a fresh idea. And, just to let loose, be your writer, just let your voice come forth.
Yeah.
And
I think there's something, people say, well, all the plots have been done, or maybe all the premises have been done, but there are different ways to start something. And I was just thinking, because I did a thing with Art Taylor, kind of a roundtable with other editors, and they asked, what's the story we'd recommend? And one of the stories that came to my mind is a story by an author named B.K. Stevens. And she's started it at such a unique place. She's at a party, and her husband introduces his wife, the main character, as, "This is Thea, and I'm her first husband." And it just, it shakes you up a little bit. And then, it sets a lot of attention to that story. Just one offhanded comment. The premise of the story might not be something that you've never heard before. It was familiar, but the way the characters kind of interacted in that story just made it a great story, chilling and
yeah. I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Questions? John, you're on.
Okay, we have quite a few questions this time, so we're going to get through as many of them as we can. Before we get started with that, I just want to remind people that if your question doesn't get covered, you might find that it appears on Jane's YouTube channel instead as an Ask Jane Shorty, we call them. Depending on how short they are, there might be 2 a week, but typically we release 1 a week on Wednesdays. And you can find that by going to janecleland.com/YouTube, and it will forward you over to her profile. So anyways, we'll get started on the queue here. First question up is, Do Ellery Queen and Alfred Hitchcock mystery magazines have different standards and different preferences for their stories?
Um, I'm not sure. One thing I'll clarify, which I meant to, we say we accept simultaneous submissions, except we don't like submissions also submitted to EQ and vice versa, because that pits us,
Against one another. Yeah, that's a very important point. You
But
tend,
if Ellery Queen rejects a story, you can send it to us. You don't have to tell us that Ellery Queen rejected it. You know, that's where I might love the story, or it might be rejected because for some reason there's a lot of stories very similar in inventory already. Um, but I think basically we're the same. We have the same sort of submission server. We like things to be, I think things in Microsoft Word works best. I love it. Number your pages, even though it's an electronic submission. Keep the pages numbered, your name and address and email address, at the top of the page, just as if you were doing a paper submission.
and double spaced.
Yeah, double space is good.
Good. Next.
Okay. Someone asks, with the longer lead time for processing and acceptance, do you have any recommendations for submitting holiday or seasonal stories that might have a particular time relevance to them?
I would say submit them all year round, because we're always looking for holiday stories. So if I'm reading a story, in January and it's a Christmas story, I pay particular interest for it. And of course, by January, we're nearly looking towards the end of the year anyway. So I'm looking ahead to the next year's. So yeah, I'm always, there's no season for certain kinds of stories. They're just always in my mind.
Good. And you mentioned Microsoft Word, and I just want to put in a little caveat that that is the industry standard. So if you're not using Office, you need to probably think about using Office.
Some stories come to us in rich text and they have to be, kind of translated.
Don't make it harder for the editor to read your work.
Thank you.
Okay, John.
Okay. That was actually a question in the queue specifically. So we knocked another one out there with that. Someone wanted to know your thoughts on cozies or humorous mysteries for either Ellery Queen or Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine. They don't recall having seen many published there.
I guess this speaks to, kind of what we're looking for, wide variety. So certainly we're looking for cozies. I mean, I I hate to speak for Ellery Queen at the same time, but I think Janet would say the same thing. They're looking for variety, and also humor. We used to do our May issue was a humor issue, and we we think we're going to pick that up again in the new year and start kind of collecting more humorous stories as a subset, a special category in the magazine, because they're fun when it works, when you can make murder funny. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I think we can all use some humor right about now. Hey, John.
Okay. Let's see. Must the crime in a submission be murder, or can it be something else, such as robbery, burglary, blackmail, etc.?
Yeah, all sorts of crime, except for, as I was saying, crime against involving children or sexual violence just kind of turns us off. But everything, or even just the threat of a crime, works. But yeah.
Yeah, but there has to be a crime.
Yeah.
Okay, someone wanted to know, are multiple submissions allowed due to the long lead times for a response, like, say, submitting a story every 2 or 3 months?
Yes. Yes, I would say that that's fine. The only thing I would kind of warn against is submitting a bunch of stories in 1 week period. In part because we are looking for variety. And so if I see like, 3 or 4 from the same author, my inclination is like, well, I'll look for one story out of this batch. And I try and fight against that because, but I think it's too much at once. Once I read a story, I want to turn to something different. So space it out every 2 weeks, I'd say, if you have a lot of stories. This seems
Good.
to work better for me psychologically.
Yep, good.
Okay. Are there any preferences on first person versus third person narratives for short stories in general?
No, I don't think so. I think, if it works, whatever works best for the short story. Um, I sometimes think second person narratives can feel a little strained and a little weird. But again, sometimes they really work. So I wouldn't say never do it, but um,
Good.
Oh, okay. And this one's more kind of overarching instead of specifically to submissions. Do you believe it's worthwhile to self-publish short stories to build a following before trying to submit to publications, anthologies, etc.?
I don't know. I can't say I've followed that. I've known authors who've done very well self-publishing their novels, um, but they've done a lot of work with the editing and the production of it. I think they did a lot of the work that a publishing house does, and it's a lot of work. So I don't know. I don't know if I could speak to that about building a following of short stories. I mean, and it's not something I think when I pick up a story from the server, I read the story first and decide whether I want it, not based so much on the author's following. I always read the cover letter after I've read the story. I mean, and I enjoy reading the cover letter, learning a little bit about the author, but I always read it at the last page.
That was what I was going to say. I would be very leery about taking that approach. I don't think having a following helps you in any way, except if you're selling a novel that you are positioning as in, I'm active in the dog community. I speak at the annual Kennel Association Club, and my novel features dogs.
Yeah.
Or if we're going to stay with short stories, if I have selling a novel of fantasy and I have 1 million followers for my fantasy short stories, and they're eager for me to produce a novel, that would interest a publisher.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think short story editors or anthology editors look to that at all.
Okay. Someone wanted to know, how important is it that a mystery start with a bang, such as them finding a body, etc.?
I think it's the demands of the story. I'm always looking for variety, so I don't want every story to start with that bang. I'm looking for various voices, various tones, everything. So and I have to say, and I'm not a book editor, but I think even in novels, sometimes there's a trend of starting with the murder like really up front. And as a reader, I sometimes like to have a little bit of context beforehand. So it depends on what type of story you're writing. For us, what type of story and where you're going with it.
And John,
Okay.
I'm just going to jump in before we continue and say, I know we're coming up on 2:00 and that some of you have to leave. Thank you for spending this time with us. The replay will be available next week. I hope you're finding great strength and solace from reading and writing. And now we're going to continue with more questions with Linda.
Okay. Let's see here. And also, just as a quick reminder as well, if you're having to take off, you can find more events like this. We have free ones scheduled through September with plans for October and November already on Jane's website, just janecleland.com/events. Okay, let's see. The next question here is, does Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine send out rejection letters? And if so, do you offer any recommendations for improvement? Or is it more no response is...
Well, you should, if you submit through our, we always respond when we can. Occasionally we get a story, or we used to when we got paper manuscripts, a story with no self-addressed stamped envelope for us to respond with. But with our submission server, we always send out a notice too. They do lately, it seems like things have been going into people's spam, sadly. So I think check that, but we do respond to everything. And what was the second part of the question?
Was whether you gave feedback.
Yes, very, very rarely. It's just, that's too time consuming for me. I think I read with my gut feeling, and then to stop and say, oh, the reason why this one didn't work or that one, it's just, I don't have time for it.
And that's not your job.
Yeah. I mean, sadly, it would be fun if it were my job. I think I'd enjoy that, but
it isn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone asks, you mentioned that short stories should be focused. Do you mean by theme? And if not, please explain what you're looking for in a focused story, since all stories are made up of so many different elements.
Right. I think what I mean, I think a story is kind of about one thing. And whereas I think a novel has a plot and a subplot and major characters and minor characters, and there's just not the room for it in the short story. So I think there's like a theme, there's some kind of crucial element, maybe one tiny little piece of of an action that gets, exploded out in the short story by that narrow focus. So it's hard to say because, it could be one tiny like piece of a mystery, or it could be I think back to BK Stevens, she had a story once where it was a set of glasses that broke one by one, and just with every time one broke, it told a piece of this story of this marriage. So the thing is that I think is keeping the idea of the story, knowing what it is, knowing what that theme is, and just making everything relate to that. I'm sorry, that's that's not the clearest thing.
I think it is clear. I just think it's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Someone wanted to know from you, Jane, the 4 Ds you listed. I believe it was in your intro.
Yes. Dedicated, determined, deadline driven, and diligent.
Okay.
I mean, what it means really is I take what I do very seriously. I work at it consistently and hard. I do not wait for the muse. I'm deadline driven. I work whether I feel like it or not. Yeah, I get it done. My new work in progress, I was talking to the great author, Jonathan Sandlifer, and I said, this project is going to kill me. And he wrote back saying, don't let it kill you. I thought, that's a really good tip. Like there's one thing to be dedicated, diligent, determined, and deadline driven. And there's another to be, it's okay to just take a breath now and again.
Okay, let's see. Someone wanted to know how many stories do you typically receive in a given year if you have an estimate?
Gosh, I think we get maybe 20 stories a week. So I want to say about 100 stories a month. If that seems like after a holiday, we get a lot of stories and people have had time to work on them, but we get a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more than 1,000 a year.
Mm.
It's a lot.
Okay. Someone wanted to know, do submissions require cover letters or can we just submit the stories themselves?
Yeah. You can just submit the stories. Um, I find the cover letters fun, but it's not necessary.
And
If
remember, she reads them after the story,
we,
so it's not going to influence her.
right.
The work has to stand alone.
If we do accept the story and you're a new author to us, what we'll send out a questionnaire with the contract. So we do get a chance to get to know you a little bit, but yeah,
Okay.
it's not necessary.
And speaking of contracts, one of the next question was, if you accept a story, is payment upon acceptance or upon publication?
Acceptance.
And they pay very quickly. They do. I will tell you, as an author, if you have an agent, your temptation is going to be to not involve the agent because obviously it's not huge amounts of money. But I'm going to recommend you ask your agent to take a look at the contract anyway. And if you're unagented, remember that the Authors Guild, if you're a member, they have lawyers that will look at contracts for you. Just, Alfred Hitchcock is a perfectly reputable organization. They're wonderful to do business with. But no one cares about your business as much as you do.
Well, and when I say when we buy a story, I'm actually just saying we're buying the rights to first time publication of the story. And I think we have some clauses too about anthologies and whatnot. But after the story has been published in the magazine and is no longer on the newsstand, it's yours to the rights revert back to you, and you can publish the story in an anthology or on your website or in your own collection. um, so it's not ours forever, it's just ours for a limited amount of time.
And that's great. Is it still called first serial rights?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the phrase, the legal phrase, first serial rights.
Mhm.
Okay. This one might be a little too nuanced or in depth for a Q&A, but I'll ask it anyway. And if it is, just tell me and we'll divert it to another form somewhere. What about cross-gender or cross-racial protagonists? Do you think that men should stick to writing male characters and women to women characters, for example, or are there any rules to follow there to ensure that you're not dooming your chances for publication or acceptance?
I think as a writer, you should be able to fully imagine your characters. I think you have to know your characters, and you have to, they have to be true to life and true to the world of the story. Um, but I can't say, only women could write women characters and vice versa. Um, you know, I think I think we have to be open to writing every sort of character that fits our story.
Okay. Someone writes, how have modern devices and technology changed the nature of traditional mystery plots? For example, phone booths used to be crucial for making untraceable calls or even a place to be murdered, but the modern reader may have literally never stepped foot in one.
It's funny to think of.
Yeah, I don't know if I could answer that. I sometimes wonder, like, can you disappear in these days? Can you really kind of go off the grid, or even can you find a private moment in a city where everybody has kind of um, cameras on their doorstep, so
It's
I
really
think
a problem. As a writer, I can tell you it has changed a lot in the last 15 years. And it's really hard for just what Linda said. To get people alone is really hard. To, to make an untraceable phone call, to email, you can't just delete things. Things never go away. It's considerations that I'm really wrestling with my new work in progress. It's an issue. But I'm going to do it, by the way. I'm going to kill people well. I'll stop there.
Okay, someone asks, do you have a preference for unusual settings, or would an author be successful using more typical settings? And must a setting these days be foreign and exotic, or would other places within the US work too?
Again, it's what's natural for the story. I love to learn something in the stories about a profession, about a place. So, a strong sense of place, whether it's next door or in another country, is I think is kind of crucial to any sort of story. But you know, I new places are exciting. So
But the new place could be a corner of the Appalachian Mountains that most people don't spend time.
Okay. The
Or
original
let me just
question.
add,
Go ahead.
excuse me, John, I don't mean to step on what you're saying, but it could also be the Katharine Hepburn Garden in the middle of New York City, which most people don't know. So it's not so much isolated or rural as in not trite, not used.
I think, particularly for mystery stories, a sense of place is kind of crucial. It's like every crime takes place in a context. Um, so it's really kind of, I think it's good to pay attention to that in the writing and to know it, that again, as a writer, know it imaginatively, thoroughly enough in your mind that you can capture it in just a few crucial details.
Okay. The original question here asks for a top 10, but we'll shorten it down to say the top 1 to 3. What are editors' top pet peeves generally when relating to submissions? And are submissions for short stories typically solicited or unsolicited?
Um, all our stories are unsolicited. Uh, um, what are my pet peeves? I would say a really sloppy story that hasn't been thoroughly gone over. Now, if I see a lot of typos, I overlook them because we do have a proofreader and we proofread everything. So by the time it comes out in the magazine, it's been gone over to death. But if I see, a lot of mistakes, a lot of comma mistakes, it just kind of sits in there like this story wasn't ready yet. It, that it could be. I think you owe it to yourself as a writer to send out the most polished piece that you have.
I think Linda is being overly generous. Do not send out anything that has typos in it. Terribly embarrassing.
And I make tons of typos. I in my email, well, I can't do text without typing typos, but
Like this.
So I think I know it happens, and we do go over everything carefully, but I just think you owe it to yourself to present something very professional, and it makes a difference to editor.
Yes, of course. I don't mean to sound, this is going to sound like I'm a little old lady with attitude, but that old saying about messy desk, messy brain. My desk is a mess. And right now my brain is full of different kinds of things. And I don't want that to translate into my story. I have to, I work with little pieces of paper. You all know, many of you know that. Where's my little sign? Here it is. I keep this right by my computer: escalate conflict, right? That's my mantra on what I try to do with every sentence, every chapter, everything. And I work with little pieces of paper of notes and words I think I'm using too often and so on. And when they're clear, because I've checked it out and I've revised it and I've looked at it and I've done it, all of a sudden my desk is a little cleaner and my brain is a little more streamlined. And that means I must be close to being ready to submit this thing. I would never ask Linda to look at anything that I didn't think was perfect, which doesn't mean it's perfect. It means it's gone through my 4Ds. So on. Anyway, I guess I'm sounding a little fussy, but it's because I feel a little fussy about this. I think it's a sign of professionalism. And I just think it is disrespectful, in my view as an author, it's disrespectful to an editor if you send out something that isn't up to snuff. I'm not speaking for Linda, I'm speaking for me and my perception of it. It tells you how I honor her and I put her on a pedestal. That's, she's like an editor, she's the queen.
There's little things that are kind of minor, but if you have a character talking and they mention a sum of money, say that as this character would say it. Is it 100? Is it 100? If you just write in the numerals, I don't know what the character is actually saying. So little things like that, I like to see.
That's a good one. And by the way, never use numbers in dialogue because people don't speak in numbers.
Yeah.
And the 100 is a century. Somebody might say that still, I guess, probably not. $100.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question, John.
Okay, one last question. Someone wanted to know, does First Serial Rights cover both print and electronic, or just print?
These days, yeah. For these days, yeah, that we do electronic copies, sell a number of electronic subscriptions, and it also, I believe I'll have to check myself. We buy world rights instead of just North American rights because we sell all over the place. But I'll have to check that with the.
Yeah, whoever gets a contract, read it.
Yeah.
And on that note, if you're not familiar with the magazine, they do sell single issues. I subscribe electronically. And I love it. There's a lot of times where you just have time to read one short story. So I do recommend it. I always enjoy it. And that's another tribute to Linda. Linda you've been so generous with your information and your time. And I thank you so very much.
Thank you. It's been fun. I've been reading the comments as they pop up from the chat. I've seen a lot of people I know. So hi, everybody. And thanks, Jane. I've really enjoyed this.
Wonderful. And John will be getting in touch with all of you about the free replay of this conversation. And I do hope that you find great strength and solace from reading and writing. And I'll see you next month, if not before. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Great weekend, everybody.